In this video, we're going to look at the SAT practice test number 1, and we're going to look at module 1 of that practice test. That is produced by the College Board, and we'll go through module 1 of test 1 in this video. If you want to find it on your own, it is published by the College Board. There's paper practice tests under this link. You can also just Google College Board SAT practice tests and come up with it. Now, I have to point out in this video that since February of 2025, the College Board no longer has the first practice test up on its website. So if you want to find this practice test, I will provide a link in the description. But as of 2025, they took away bundle 1, 2, and 3, and now the bundles start at 4 and go on to 10. So, but this practice test still exists. Again, you can find it in the link in the description of this video. When you open that practice test up, the first page will look like this. Obviously, practice test number 1. The first part is the reading and writing portion. There's module 1 and module 2 of reading and writing. And then it starts around page 30 with the math part. So module 1 starts on page 30. The first test, or the first sheet, gives you some formulas and some information about number of degrees and radians in an arc, and that the sum of the measures in degrees of the angles of a triangle is 180. Then it gives you a sheet on how to write your answers, whether it be a fraction or a decimal or a mixed number. And then the questions start. So these are the questions we're going to go over in this video. We're going to go over the questions in module 1 of the SAT practice test number 1. So let's get started. Question number 1 says, what is 10% of 470? Well, we have to know that 10% of a number means I need to take 10% written as either a decimal or a fraction, and then multiply it times that number. So 10% of 470 is 0.10. Multiplied times 470, you can use whatever notation you want. And you end up with 47. Therefore, the answer to question number 1 is B, 47. Question number 2 says, which equation has the same solution as the given equation? So what equation is equivalent to the given equation? We have 4x plus 6 is equal to 18. Now, if I were to solve this equation, the first step that I would do is I would subtract 6 from both sides to get rid of the 6 on the left-hand side. If I subtract 6 from the left-hand side, I end up with 4x. If I subtract 6 from the right-hand side, I end up with 12. So I get 4x is equal to 12. And those are my options here. Always in all of these options, we have 4x on the left-hand side. So here it's pretty clear that the answer is C. 4x is equal to 12 is the equation that is equivalent to the given equation. So equivalent means has the same solution. Let's look at question number 3. It says the total cost in dollars to rent a surfboard consists of a $25 service fee and a $10 per hour rental fee. A person rents a surfboard for T hours and intends to spend a maximum of $75 to rent the surfboard. Which inequality represents this situation? So what I would do is I would start out with the cost. The cost is a $25 service fee plus $10 times the number of hours that we rent it for. So 25 plus 10T is the cost. This person intends to spend a maximum of 75, so it's okay to be under 75 or equal to 75. So the total cost of the surfboard should be less than or equal to 75. And we can see that for number 3, that is question number 3, that means the answer is D. 25 plus 10T is less than or equal to 75. Question number 4 says the function g is defined by g of x is equal to x squared plus 9. For which value of x is g of x equal to 25? Now, you can solve this in various ways. If you wanted to, you could plug in 4, see what happens, plug in 5, see what happens, plug in 9, see what happens, and so on, and plug in 13 and see what happens. So that is one way. Just check all of the answers and see which one gives you 25. But another way, the more formal way, would be to say since g of x is equal to x squared plus 9, and we're looking for when the output of g of x is equal to 25, basically I'm finding which value of x forces x squared plus 9 to be equal to 25. So I can solve this equation. Subtracting 9 from both sides would give me x squared is equal to 16. Now, technically speaking, we get two answers. We get an answer which is x equals 4, and another answer which is x is equal to negative 4 when I take the positive and negative square root of 16. So either of those two will work. The only option that we have is A, which is 4. Negative 4 is not one of my options. So the answer to question number 4 is A, which is 4. Question number 5 says each face of a fair 14-sided die is labeled with a number 1 through 14, with a different number appearing on each face. If the die is rolled one time, what is the probability of rolling a 2? So we have to know a little bit about probabilities. The probability of rolling a 2, I'm going to calculate this in the classical probability sense, since all of them, since it's a fair die, all the numbers have an equal chance of showing up. Therefore, since there are 14 numbers, the denominator is going to be 14. Now there's only one number 2 on the die, so therefore the chance of rolling the number 2 is 1 divided by 14, or 1 out of 14. That's classical probability. The number of events that are in what I'm looking for, so the number of options, outcomes in my event, divided by the total number of outcomes possible. So in this case, that's 1 over 14. And that's the answer to question number 5, A, or 1 over 14. Question 6 says a printer produces posters at a constant rate of 42 posters per minute. At what rate in posters per hour does the printer produce the posters? And so The first thing we have to realize is that there are 60 minutes in 1 hour. And then if we're talking about 42 posters per minute, a lot of times I think of that as a ratio, 42 posters per 1 minute. Or I'll say 1 minutes now. And then the way to translate posters per minutes to posters per hour is do another multiplication using the fact that 60 minutes is 1 hour. In order to get the minutes labels to quote cancel out, I'd put the 60 minutes on top and the 1 hour on bottom. And what you'll see is that this will cancel the minutes here, will cancel the minutes here. We'll get 42 times 60 divided by 1 hour when I do that. And 42 times 60 is 2,520. That is posters per 1 hour. By the way, the answer is asking in what rate in posters per hour does the printer produce posters. So when you type in your answer will simply be 2,520. That would be the answer you type in. So 2,520 is the answer to question 6. Let's look at question 7. It says the function f is defined by the equation f of x is equal to 7x plus 2. What is the value of f of x when x is equal to 4? So this is basically just asking us to plug in 4 into my function f. 7 multiplied times 4 plus 2 is going to be 28 plus 2, which is 30. And so 30 is the answer to question number 7. So 30 is the value of f of x when x is equal to 4. And we can write that as f of 4 is equal to 30. When you type in your answer, you'll just type in 30. Question 8 says a teacher is creating an assignment worth 70 points. The assignment will consist of questions worth 1 point and questions worth 3 points. Which equation represents the situation where x represents the number of 1-point questions and y represents the number of 3-point questions? If x represents the number of 1-point questions, then 1 point for every question count of x, that's how many points we're going to have from 1-point questions. If the y represents 3-point questions, then the number of points we're going to have from questions in the category of y is 3 times y. So 1x plus 3y has to give me the 70 points total. Now, in an equation like this, having 1 as a coefficient is not needed to write. So we don't have to write the coefficient of 1. And therefore, the answer to question 8 is going to be x plus 3y is equal to 70, which is option D. So the answer to question 8 is D, which says x plus 3y is equal to 70. Question 9 says right triangles LMN and PQR are similar, where L and M correspond to P and Q respectively. So by the way, that means, well, I'll finish the statement first. Angle M has measure of 53. What is the measure of angle Q? So when we say L and M correspond to P and Q respectively, that means L corresponds to P. And as a measure of angles, L will be equal to P. And since M is going to correspond with Q, as an angle measurement, M is going to be equal to Q as an angle measurement. Now it says angle M has a measure of 53 degrees. So if M is equal to 53 degrees and M is equal to Q, then Q also has to be 53 degrees. Therefore, option B is the correct answer. I didn't even need the fact that these are right triangles. Option B is the correct answer since M and Q have to be the same angle measurements. Question number 10 says y equals negative 3x, 4x plus y equals 15. The solution to the given system of equations is x comma y. What is the value of x? So what we would do in this case is we'd start to solve this system of equations. And the way I would do this, since we have y is equal to an expression in x, I'll use the substitution method where we have 4x plus y is equal to 15. And we're going to substitute out y for the expression negative 3x, or replace the y with a negative 3x. In solving this, all we have to do on the left-hand side is combine like terms. 4x plus negative 3x is 1x, which I can write just as x. And then that's equal to 15. So I know that the x value of the solution to this system of linear equations is 15. Now we can stop right there because that is what this question is asking. It's saying, what is the value of x in the solution to this system of linear equations? So clearly we can see that the answer is C, 15. Question 11 says, which of the following equations is the most appropriate linear model for the data shown in the scatter plot? Now, I'm going to go through this. I'm just going to notice that the data in the scatter plot are moving downwards. So if I were to create a linear model, I don't know what exactly it's going to look like, but it's going to move down on average. So it's going to move down. And also it looks like it's going to cross a little bit above 10. So the most appropriate linear model is going to have slope, which is negative, and is going to have a y-intercept of 0 and then a little above 10. So let's look at our options for lines. We have y equals negative 1.9x minus 10.1. A minus 10.1 would be mean your y-intercept is at 0, negative 10.1. So that's way down below the graph. You can see that y equals negative 1.9x, that's a negative slope, plus 10.1, that's a y-intercept of positive 10.1. That does match the features for this scenario. For options C and D, both of those have positive slopes. So since we want a negative slope, which intersects at about 0, 10.1, we want option B. So B is the answer to question 11. Let's look at question 12. This says the graph of y equals f of x is shown, where the function f is defined by f of x is equal to ax to the third plus bx squared plus cx plus d. And a, b, c, and d are constants. For how many values of x does f of x equal 0? So this is a cubic polynomial, a polynomial of degree 3. Since our function is equal to that, we say our function is a cubic polynomial function. And the thing about cubic polynomials is the number of times they cross the x-axis can be 1, 2, or 3. It can't be more than 3. And visually speaking, we can see that there are 3 places where this crosses the x-axis. Crossing the x-axis means that when we put in an x value, we get out a y value of 0. So that means f of x would be equal to 0. So since we see that there are 3 places where our function crosses the x-axis, that means there's 3 places where f of x is equal to 0. So the correct answer there is C, which is 3. Crosses the axis in 3 different spots. So that's the question, the answer to question 12. In the next problem, this is question 13. It says Vivian bought party hats and cupcakes for $71. Each package of party hats costs $3 and each cupcake cost $1. If Vivian bought 10 packages of hats, how many cupcakes did she buy? So I'm going to set up an equation here for the amount she spent on hats and cupcakes. Since each package of hats costs $3, 3 times the number of packages of hats is going to be the money spent on hats. And since each cupcake cost $1, 1 times C is going to be the amount spent on cupcakes. That has to sum up or add up to 71. 3H plus 1C has to be equal to 71. Now we know that Vivian bought 10 packages of party hats. So 3 times 10 is how much she spent on hats. In order to find out how much she spent on cupcakes, I only need to solve this equation. So we'd end up with 30 plus C is equal to 71. Subtracting 30 from both sides gives me that the amount of cupcakes that she bought was 41. So Vivian bought 41 cupcakes, and 41 would be the correct answer to question 13. Question 14 says, what is one of the solutions to the given equation? Z squared plus 10z minus 24 is equal to 0. The thing I should recognize here is that this is a quadratic equation with variable z. There's a number of different ways you can solve this. You can solve this by completing the square. You can solve this by using the quadratic formula. Or probably the most straightforward way is you can solve this by using the factoring and the 0 factor property. We already have the right-hand side equal to 0, so all I have to do is factor the left-hand side. When I factor the left-hand side, I'm looking for numbers that multiply to give me negative 24, but add to give me 10. Well, it turns out that negative 2 and positive 12 multiply to give me a negative 24, and add to give me a positive 10. The zero factor property states that we can set each one of those components equal to 0. And so this equation has two answers, one of which is z equals 2, and the other is z equals negative 12. So 2 and negative 12 are the two options for solutions to this equation. And 14 just asks, what is one of the solutions? So you can either write the number 2, or you could have written the number negative 12, and that would be a correct answer for 14. Let's check out number 15. 15 says, bacteria are growing in a liquid growth medium. There are 300,000 cells per milliliter during the initial observation. The number of cells per milliliter doubles every 3 hours. How many cells per milliliter will there be 15 hours after the initial observation? So the first thing I want to do is realize that if we're talking about 15 hours and each time frame of a 3-hour period is a doubling, that means there's going to be 5 doubling time periods. So we're going to get doubling to happen 5 times over. Now we're starting with 300,000 cells per milliliter. Doubling means we're going to times it by 2. And because we're going to do that 5 times, we're actually going to take 300,000 and multiply it times 2 to the 5th power. When you do that, you end up with 9,600,000. And so how many cells per milliliter will there be 15 hours after the initial observation? Well, the answer is D, 9,600,000. So 9,600,000, letter D is our answer. For question 16, it says which expression is equivalent to 6x to the 8th times y squared plus 12x squared times y squared. And when you look at this, we have 4 options for answers. All of them are essentially some version of a factored out greatest common factor. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to factor out the greatest common factor. So we first start by asking ourselves 6 and 12, what number divides 6 and 12? What's the highest number that will divide both 6 and 12? The answer to that is 6. Then I look at x to the 8th and x squared. The biggest factor there is the x squared. Then we have y squared and y squared. So I can also factor out a y squared. So the greatest common factor is 6x squared times y squared. If I factor that out of this expression, then each term can be divided by 6x squared y squared. If I do that, I'll be left with x raised to the 6th power, because x to the 8th divided by x squared is x to the 6th. And then 12x squared y squared divided by 6x squared y squared is just a 2. So I end up with 6x squared y squared times the quantity x to the 6th plus 2. And obviously that's answer C there. So the answer to question 16 is C, which is 6x squared y squared times the quantity x to the 6th plus 2. Question 17 says a neighborhood consists of a 2-hectare park and a 35-hectare residential area. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I always think of acres, so sometimes I emphasize different syllables. But anyways, 2-hectare park and a 35-hectare residential area. The total number of trees in a neighborhood is 3,934. The equation 2x plus 35y equals 3,934 represents this situation. Which of the following is the best interpretation of x in this context? Well, the 2 is matching up to the amount of hectares in the park, and the 35 is going to match up with the amount of hectares in the residential area. And so when it says 2x, x has to be the number of trees per hectare in the park, and y has to be the number of trees per hectare in the residential area. And so if we're looking at the best interpretation of x, it'd be the average number of trees per hectare in the park, which is A. Therefore, the answer to question 17 is A. The average number of trees per hectare in the park is the representation of x. Let's take a look at problem 18. The graph shows the relationship between the number of shares of stock from company A, which we label as X, and the number of shares of stock from company B, which we label as Y. That Simone can purchase. Which equation could represent this relationship? Now, there's a number of different ways to go about this. We're trying to find the equation of this line. And I want to point out that this line goes through 2 points. One of those points is 0, 40, and the other point is 60, 0. Again, both points on this line, 0, 40 and 60, 0. Therefore, if I plug these points in, they should give me true statements for the line. And that's probably how I would do this one. I would plug in those 2 points. For instance, if you plugged in 0, 40 into the part A, you would get 40 for Y, and then 8 times 0 is 0. And so 0 plus 12 would be 12. You get a false statement. And so option A is not going to work. Option B, well, if I plugged in 0, 40, 8 times 0 is 0, plus 12 times 40 is 480. So for option B, when I plug in 0, 40, I get 480 is equal to 480. Also, when I plug in 60, 0, I would get 8 times 60. 8 times 60 is 480, plus 12 times 0, which is 0, is equal to 480. So when I plug in 0, 40, I get a true statement. When I plug in 60, 0, I get a true statement. So I get 2 true statements when I plug in these 2 points. And that means this equation could represent the relationship that is drawn up here. Now, you can check for yourself if you're not convinced that 0, 40, and 60, 0 will not work for options C and D either. Again, just plug in 0, 40 in for C. Both of these aren't going to work, but if you plugged in 0, 40, you get 40 is equal to 8. That's obviously false. If you plugged in 0, 40 into D, what you'd end up with is 320 is equal to 480. That's obviously false as well. So we end up with the only true option, which is B. B is the equation that could represent this scenario. Let's look at problem 19. It says circle A has a radius of 3n and circle B has a radius of 129n, where n is some positive constant. The area of circle B is how many times the area of circle A? So we need to know that the area of a circle in general is equal to pi multiplied times the radius squared. If you didn't know that, you could go back up to the practice test and look for those formulas. And obviously A equals pi r squared for a circle is one of the formulas that is given. So the circle A has a radius of 3n. So the area of circle A is going to be pi times, in parentheses, 3n quantity squared. When I square all of that, I get 9 times n squared times pi. The area of B is going to be pi times the radius squared, but the radius is 129 times n. If you square 129, you end up with 16,641. Then we'd have the n squared and the pi as well. And so the question is asking how many times, the area of circle B is how many times the area of circle A. So what do we need to multiply 9 by to get 16,641? Another way to do this is just to say if we have 16,641 times n squared times pi, and that's all being divided by 9n squared times pi. This will give you how many times the area of A is the area of B. I'm sorry, is the area of B is how many times the area of A, excuse me. And the n squareds are going to cancel out, the pi's are going to cancel out, and you just have to take 16,641 divided by 9. That turns out to be 1,849. So the area of B is 1,849 times the area of A. Area of B is 1,849 times the area of circle C, or the area of circle A. I keep saying C. So the answer there is D, 1,849. So that is the answer to question 19. Question 21 says the frequency table summarizes 57 data values in a data set. What is the maximum data value in the data set? Now we have to understand that the values are in this list. Frequency is just how often they occurred. So when it says 6 has a frequency of 3, what that means is that 6 happened 3 times. So there'd be 6, and then another 6, and then another 6 in our data set. Same thing with 7. There'd be a 7, and then another 7, and then another 7. For 10, there'd be 9 copies of 10. So when it says what is the maximum data value in the data set, we just have to figure out what's the maximum value that occurred at least once. And the maximum data value that occurred at least once is the number 14. So 14 would be the maximum value in our data set. Question 21 is the next question. It says a circle in the XY plane has a diameter whose endpoints are 2, 4 and 2, 14. An equation of this circle is x minus 2 squared plus y minus 9 squared is equal to radius squared, where r is a positive constant. That is the radius, by the way, of the circle. What is the value of r? Now, there's a couple of different ways to do this, not surprisingly. So I'll do it both ways. Knowing that r is the radius is the key thing. So the first is that if we take the distance between these 2 points, between 2, 4 and 2, 14, we see that there is a total of 10 units worth of difference. The x values are steady, the y values change by 10. So the distance there is 10, and that is actually the diameter of a circle. If I want the radius of a circle, well, the radius of a circle is such that it's half the diameter, or some people would say the diameter is twice the radius. So if the diameter is 10, then the radius of the circle has to be 5. So that's one way to see that, is look at the distance between these 2 endpoints of the diameter. The other way we could do this is to notice that this circle has center of 2, 9. So if the center is 2, 9, then finding the distance from 2, 9. So the distance from the center to one of these 2 points, either 2, 4 or 2, 14, would give me the radius. So let's go ahead and do that. Find the distance from the center to 2, 4, let's say. Well, that's obviously 5. And the distance from the center to a point at the edge of your circle or a point on the circle is the radius. So therefore the r is equal to 5. So either way is perfectly fine. You can measure the distance between the endpoints of a diameter, or you can measure the distance from the center of the circle to an endpoint of the circle. So that's the answer to question 21. R is equal to 5. The measure of angle R is 2 pi over 3 radians. The measure of angle T is 5 pi over 12 radians, greater than the measure of angle R. What is the measure of angle T in degrees? So this is question 22. T is going to be equal to the measure of angle R plus 5 pi over 12. That's what it says. Measure of angle t is 5 pi over 12 radians greater than the measure of angle r. So this is the value of t in radians. Now we know that the measure of angle r is 2 pi over 3. So we know that t is going to be equal to 2 pi over 3 plus 5 pi over 12. So we just add those up. You can do that by hand by realizing that 2 over 3 is the same thing as 8 over 12. Or you could utilize your calculator and say, what's 2/3 plus 5/12? And either way, you'll get 13 twelfths. So the angle in radians is 13 pi over 12. So t is 13 pi over 12 in radians. But we want our answer to be in degrees. So if we have 13 pi over 12 radians, to convert from radians to degrees, I'm going to multiply by some ratio. Now, if you forget how many radians or how many degrees are in a radian or what's the conversion, that's actually one of the things that the test lists out. It says the number of degrees in the arc of a circle is 360. The number of radians in the arc of a circle is 2 times pi. So 360 degrees is 2 pi radians. Now, a lot of times when we write this, instead of writing 360 degrees is 2 pi radians, what we do is we divide both things by 2. So 360 divided by 2 is 180. And then 2 pi divided by 2 is just pi. So a lot of times people look at that as 180 degrees is pi radians. If I want to convert from radians to degrees, I'm going to have to put the degrees on top, the radians on bottom. Notice what's going to happen. The pi is going to cancel out on top and bottom, and I'll be left with 13 times 180 divided by 12 as the degree measurement. And so you can do that on your calculator, 13 times 180 divided by 12. The pi's cancel each other out, and we end up with 195 degrees as the measure of angle t. So the measure of angle t in radians is 13 pi over 12. The measure of angle t in degrees is 195 degrees. And therefore the answer to question 22 is C, which is 195. Question 23 says a certain town has an area of 4.36 square miles. What is the area in square yards of this town? Well, this is another conversion problem. And basically what we need to do is we need to realize that if 1 mile is equal to 1,760 yards, if we square both sides, that tells me 1 square mile, I'll write that as MI, is equal to 1,060 squared. 1,060 squared is a very large number. It would be 3,097,600 square yards. And again, we'll use that notation. So 3,097,600 square yards. And if we have 4.36 square miles, We can multiply that times a conversion ratio of square yards divided by square miles. So multiply that by 3,097,600 square yards per 1 square mile. By the way, when I squared this, 1 squared is 1, so that's why I kept the 1. 1760 squared is this 3 million number, and so that's where I got that from. When you do that calculation, or these calculations, the mile squared or the square miles will cancel each other out, and you'll end up with 13,505,536. So 13,505,536 square yards. And that's it. That would be the answer to question 23. Obviously, that's answer D there. So the answer to question 23 is D, 13,505,536. Let's look at question 24. It says for a line H, the table shows 3 values of X and their corresponding values of Y. Line K is the result of translating that line H down 5 units in the XY plane. What is the x-intercept of line K? This one has quite a few steps, but that's all right. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up line H. So we're going to look at line H. Now, line H I will write in slope-intercept form. The slope of this line is going to be the change in Y values divided by the change in X values. So if I look at the points that it goes through the point 18,130 and 23,160. So the change in Y values would be 160 minus 130. The change in X values would be 23 minus 18. So that's 30 over 5, which is a 6. So the slope of the line H is going to be 6. Once I figure that out, I can write Y equals 6x plus b, and I can find the b by plugging in one of these points. It doesn't matter which one. You can plug in the point 18,130, you can plug in the point 23,160, or you can plug in the point 26,178. The point I'm going to choose to plug in is 18,130. So 130 in for Y when X is 18. That allows me to solve for B. 6 times 18 is 108. So we end up with 130 is equal to 108 plus B. Subtracting 108 from both sides, we end up with a B value, which is 22. And so this is line H. Line H is the line Y equals 6x plus 22. Now line K is the result of translating line H down 5 units. Now, if you translate down 5 units, you can either subtract 5 on the right-hand side so that the corresponding Y value would have gone down by 5, or you could have added 5 to the left-hand side. I think it's a little bit easier to subtract 5 from the right-hand side. So that means line K, I'll write it as lowercase, is Y equals 6x plus Well, when I translate down 5, subtract 5 from 22, I end up with a 17. So y equals 6x plus 17 is the line K that we're examining. And now I just need to test out points. Plug in various points and see which ones of these work. So for instance, A is negative 26 over 3 comma 0. So if we're plugging in point A, again, this is into the second line here. What we would do is plug in 0 for Y and then plug in negative 26 over 3 for X. When you calculate that, you end up with something that says 0 is equal to, I got to type this into my calculator, negative 35. That's obviously false. So we know that A is not going to work. And then we're going to do that for every single other point on here. So B, we would plug in the point negative 9 halves, comma 0. So 0's in for Y. And then negative 9 halves is in for X. 6 times negative 9 halves plus 17 gives me a negative 10. So this yields the equation 0 is equal to negative 10, which is, again, is also false. So we go on to the next values. Negative 11 over 3 comma 0. Plug in a negative 11 over 3. 6 times negative 11 over 3 plus 17 gives me a negative 5. So I end up with 0 equals negative 5. That's also false, so that is not the correct x-axis, or excuse me, x-intercept. And then the last point that I have to plug in is negative 17 over 6 comma 0. So plug in negative 17 over 6. You'll get 0 on the left-hand side, and it turns out you also get 0 on the right-hand side. So this answer is true, and that means D is the correct x-intercept of line K. So D is the right answer. That gives me a true statement. Now you'll notice here at the end, I plugged in all of these values. Another way to approach this problem without having to plug in a bunch of values is just to find the x-intercept of line K manually. To find the x-intercept, you plug in 0 for Y, and then you solve for X. And so you could have also done that. You could have plugged in 0 for Y into line K, and then solve for X. You'd subtract 17 from both sides. You get negative 17 is equal to 6x, and then you divide by 6 on both sides, giving you negative 17 divided by 6 as your x value. So that would mean that your x-intercept is negative 17 over 6, comma 0. So that's another option for finding the x-intercept. You don't have to plug and try every point if you don't want to. You could have just plugged in 0 for Y and then solved for X. But in any case, either of these cases, negative 17 over 6 comma 0 is the correct answer. Let's look at problem 25. It says in the xy plane, the graph of an equation y equals negative x squared plus 9x minus 100 intersects the line x equals c at exactly 1 point. What is the value of c? Now, one of the things we need to know is that what we have here with y equals negative x squared plus 9x minus 100 is a parabola pointing down. So if you wanted to approach this problem graphically, you could graph this thing out and look at that parabola pointing down. And then the only time that a horizontal line intersects the parabola at exactly 1 point is when that horizontal line goes through the very top point of a parabola pointing down, or the bottom point of a parabola which is pointing up. Otherwise, if I have a line right here, it's going to go through 2 spots on the parabola. And if I have a horizontal line here, it's going to go through 0 spots on the parabola. So essentially, I need the y value of the vertex, and that will be my value of c. So y equals c is a horizontal line. The only time it goes through 1 point on the parabola is when it hits the vertex. And so we just need to find the y value of the vertex. Again, if you do this graphically, then it goes pretty quickly. You can just graph this equation and find the vertex. If you have access to a graphing calculator, that's really nice. If you do not have access to a graphing calculator, then you can still do it because the vertex has x value, which is opposite of b over 2a. So knowing that, and by the way, the b here is standing for the coefficient of x. The a is standing for the coefficient of x squared. So in this case, it's going to be the opposite of 9 divided by 2 times negative 1. So the vertex is going to have an x value of 9/2, or 4.5, whichever way you'd like to write that. I'll leave it as 9/2 for right now. Well, if the vertex has x value of 9/2, what is the y value of the vertex? Well, I can find that by just plugging in 9/2 into this equation. So we take negative 9/2 quantity squared plus 9 multiplied times 9/2 minus 100. So I plugged it into my equation, and I would simplify that right-hand side. The y value in this case, you can square that. By the way, be careful when you write the squaring, because you're going to have to square 9 and square the 2 if you write it this way. But negative the quantity 9/2 squared plus 9 times 9 over 2 minus 100 as a decimal gives me negative 79.75. Obviously, these are all written in fraction form as improper fractions. So if you convert that to an improper fraction, you'd get negative 319 divided by 4. And there you go. That's the y value of the vertex, which means that c needs to be equal to negative 319 over 4. And so your answer is option C. Interestingly enough, the value of C has to be option C. So that's the answer to question 25. Let's look at question 26. It says, for each real number r, which of the following points lies on the graph of each equation in the xy plane for the given system? Now, this one is a little bit more difficult, but it's not crazy. There's one thing you can look at. First off, these two lines are actually the same line, because if you take 5 times both sides of that first line, what you'll get is you'll get that second line. You'll get 10x plus 15y is equal to 35. So these two lines are the same line. They're the exact same line. So if one solution works on one of them, then that solution will work on the other. So I can just check my solutions on one of these lines. So I'll plug in each of these options into this first line, the 2x plus 3y equals 7, and see what happens. By the way, this isn't the only way you could do this, but this is one way you could do this. The other way is, for this, you could plug in the y value of r and then solve for x. I'll plug in the x value for r, solve for y. Plug in the x value of r, solve for y. But that's a little bit more cumbersome. So I am going to take and plug in each of my options into this first equation and see if they give me a true statement. So for part A, actually, let me do it this way. We'll do this for A, B, and C, and D, I guess. Do it very thorough today. So for this first option, in for the x value, we're going to put in r over 5 plus 7. In for the y value, we're going to put in negative r over 5 plus 35. And then we're going to simplify that. We'd get 2/5 times r plus 14 minus 3/5 times r plus 35 times 3. That's 105. And obviously that's going to be set equal to 7. And so is this a true statement for all values of r? Well, it's clearly not. We're saying is negative 1/5 times r equal to a constant for all values of r. That's not going to happen. So 14 plus 105, and that is 119. Subtracting 119 from both sides would give you a negative 112. That is not true for all real values of r. So A does not work. Now let's look at B. So for B, I'll plug in the x value of negative 3r over 2 plus 7/2. And for the y value, I'll plug in an r. While I'm at it, let's go ahead and do that same thing for C. For C, the x value is r. The y value is 2r over 3 plus 7/3. And for D, the x value once again is r, and the y value is negative 3r over 2 plus 7/2. And then we go ahead and simplify. So I'll do that for b. We're going to end up with negative 3r plus 7 plus 3r is equal to 7. We get 7 equals 7, which is obviously a true statement. Excuse me. 7 equals 7, which is obviously a true statement. That is true regardless of what value I plug in r. So that is true for all real numbers r. This one is only true for one real number r. So b is actually the solution that we want. So b is the points, all points that look like that are going to satisfy this system of equations. So B is the answer because that's the one which satisfies all systems of equations. By the way, if you did this for part C and part D, you'd get a similar thing that you got in A. Basically for part C, I won't go through all of the steps, but you'll end up with 4r plus 7 is equal to 7, and that's obviously not true for all values of r. And then for part D, when you did that, you would end up with negative 2.5 r plus 10.5 is equal to 7. And that's obviously not true for all values of r either. So A, C, and D are not true for all values of r. B is true for all values of r. And so all points that look like this, all points that look like point B, are solutions to this system of linear equations. So B is the correct answer. Now, lastly, we're going to do number 27. 27 does not have this picture provided. I've already made this picture. I'll talk about how I get this picture in just a moment. But 27 says the perimeter of an equilateral triangle is 624 centimeters. The height of this triangle is k times root 3 centimeters, where k is a constant. What is the value of k? So if I have an equilateral triangle, that means all of the angles and all of the sides are equal. The perimeter is a sum of the three sides. So the perimeter being 624 forces each of these sides to be of length 208. That's 624 divided by 3. Now we're going to look at the height of this triangle. The height is from the steepest point down to the base and hitting the base at a right angle. When we do that on an equilateral triangle, it splits my base into two halves. So one side of this base is going to be 104, and the other side is going to be another 104, adding to 208 total. Now, at this point, in order to find the height of this triangle, you can use the Pythagorean theorem on this interior right triangle. This interior right triangle has hypotenuse of 208. The height is one leg, and the other leg is 104. So remember, the Pythagorean theorem says a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, where a and b are the legs of a right triangle, and c is the hypotenuse of a right triangle. If I type that in, I get 104 squared plus the height squared is equal to 208 squared. So this is one option for finding the height. And I'll go through this option. If we take 104 and square it, and take 208 and square that. 104 squared is 10,816. 208 squared is 43,264. So when I subtract 10,816 from both sides, I'd get that my height squared is equal to 32,448. That means the height is the square root of that. And because height is a distance, we have to take the positive square root of that. And then it says the height is k times square root of 3. So I basically need to factor a 3 out of this. And when I factor a 3 out of this, what I end up with is the square root. Let's call it, I'll write it this way, 10,816 multiplied times 3, all under the square root. Well, 10,816 is a nice perfect square that I can take the square root of. So if I take the square root of 10,816, that's 104. I actually already knew that from up here. So it's 104 times the square root of 3. So the height is 104 times the square root of 3. And it's asking me, says that the height of the triangle is k times square root of 3, where k is a constant. What is the value of k? The answer is that k would have to be 104. And so that is the answer. Now, this is one way to do this problem. The other way to do this problem is to realize that equilateral triangles also have another property, that their angles are all the same. So this angle on the lower left corner would have to be equal to this angle on the right corner. And if you add these two angles together on the top corner, that would all those would have to be the same. So equilateral triangle has angles which are, since all angles add up to 180 degrees, the angles would be 60, 60, and then each of these little pieces would be 30. And so that means that we have a 60 degree, 30 degree, 90 degree right triangle. And we can actually use that too if we wanted to find the length of this leg or the length of this base. This is one of our other formulas. So you can see that when you have a 60 degree, 30 degree, 90 degree right triangle, so you have a 60 degree, 30 degree right triangle, if the hypotenuse is 2x and the length of one leg is x, then the length of the other leg, the missing leg in our case, would be x times square root of 3. So knowing that the hypotenuse of that right triangle is 208 and that the x value is 104, we could see that the height of that right triangle should have been 104 times square root of 3. So that's another way we could have solved that problem, to see that x would have to be 104. But in either case, the answer to question 27 is that k is equal to 104. So this is the end of Module 1 of the SAT practice test number 1. If you go through all of those questions, you'll see at the end, there's another Module 2. That'll be in another video. And there'll be a lot of other practice tests in other videos. I'll try to put links in the description of this video to the practice test number 1, module 2 video. But that is it for practice test 1, module 1.